So thanks so much for the invitation to speak here. I'm obviously chief economist at CMA, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity. So it's a standard caveat, which is what I say is what I believe, not necessarily what the CMA believes. So 20 years of Regulation 1/2003, competition law procedure in need of an upgrade. You are going to be delighted to know that I'm not going to talk to you as an economist about legal procedure, incredibly important though it is. What I'm going to talk about is some stuff that is, I think, very important at the moment in terms of competition policy, but was not on our radar 20 years ago. So we already had Akim raise the point about, the App Store didn't exist 20 years ago. I'm going to talk about some concerns we now have that just weren't on our radar 20 years ago. And I'm also going to say, and this is sort of the main point of what I want to say, is there's a lot we still don't know. And there's important issues out there, and there's quite a lot of evidence on those issues out there, but none of it is dispositive, and it would be incredibly helpful to have more research. I'm very much, when I'm talking in that context, talking to practicing academic economists who want to do interesting research topics, because there's a load available in competition policy at the moment. And this is, of course, it's super important at the moment that we have effective competition policy. Why is that? Well, because of course there's a sort of cost of living crisis, and anything that reduces competition and leads to higher prices or less innovation is going to be particularly bad in times of an economic crisis. We also know that historically, times of economic crises have quite often been periods of increased concentration, mergers being allowed through, possibly because we've got failing firms. And also another issue at the moment that I think is very important is that there's a number of established facts, that people know that lead to policy interventions or are leading to discussions about policy interventions that might actually be very unhelpful and might not be based on genuinely established facts. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, allow time for questions. I'm going to talk about the evidence that we have around under-enforcement of competition policy generally over the last 20 years. And there's a definite school of thought saying we have under-enforced over the last 20 years. And to some extent, I think that's right, but I want to really get us to understand exactly what the evidence is around that. I particularly in that context going to talk about merger policy and some places where we've got merger policy wrong, and it would be good if we change that. I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of issues that really weren't on our radar 20 years ago, but are now on policymakers' radar, that people are talking about being things that competition policy should start to care about, particularly about labour markets and particularly about economic distribution rather than just aggregate consumer welfare. And again, what is the evidence we would need to be able to think actually we should start looking at those issues? And then I'm very briefly, if there's time, going to touch on a couple of online harms which we weren't thinking about 20 years ago because they just didn't exist in the same way the App Store didn't exist. Okay, so fantastic. Let me now get started. So first I want to talk about is this evidence of under-enforcement generally over the last 20 years. There's a body of thought that says we've allowed too many mergers, that we've not acted strongly enough against dominant companies, particularly not dominant companies that we have allowed to extend their dominance into multiple markets. So what's the evidence for this? Okay, so the standard piece of evidence that people talk about is all this work which is started by Deluca and Eckert in the US 5-6 years ago, where what they did is they looked at markups over time. So these are the extent to which prices are above marginal costs. Okay, and in this this paper published in 2020, but it's been around for 2 or 3 years before that, they had this remarkable statistic that between 1980 and 2014, when their data set at that point runs out, markups in the US increased from about 18%, so price about 18% above marginal cost, to more than 67%. Okay, it's a very substantial increase in markup, potentially very worrying. We also have, they looked at other countries as well, get a similar picture for Europe. I'm sorry, I missed off the dates from this graph, but the left-hand side is actually 1980. The right-hand side is 2016. And again, you can see that markups across Europe have gone up very substantially. Okay. What about in the UK? Obviously, where I come from, so I have particular interest there. That same true in the UK. So markets have gone up between 1990 and 2017 from about 15% to 55%. Okay, this is evidence from Equilanti et al. So it's a paper from the Bank of England. Okay, potentially very worrying. Okay, what's causing this? Okay, and this is where I think there's a lot we don't know. And if policymakers are going to get very upset about failure of competition policy, then we need to make sure they're right to get upset. They may well be right to get upset, but we need to make sure we have the right evidence base for that. So there's a number of competing explanations for these figures. One is the simple market power has grown. So, that's Gutierrez and Philippon argue that. Jonathan Baker in his book, The Antitrust Paradigm, argues that. Generally, the sort of hipster antitrust movement argues that. I would say I thought of hipster antitrust as a term of disparagement 3 or 4 years ago. I now beginning to have to accept actually they've made some quite good points we need to think about. So it's no longer a term disparagement. Doesn't mean you agree with them. So maybe market power genuinely has increased. Okay. But if we try and decompose some of this evidence, so this is again for the UK, but we could get the same figure for the US. What have we got here? It's hard to read, but the average increase in markup is the gray line in the middle, the one that basically doesn't move. The black line at the top that goes up steeply, that is the markup of the top 10% of firms with the highest markups. So that's where markups have really increased. Okay, and there's what's causing that? Well, maybe there are superstar firms. This is the Auto et al. Argument that there are just, these are fantastically efficient firms. It's noticeable that a lot of this increase in markups has been reallocation from low markup firms losing market share, which is captured by high markup firms in the same sector. So, fantastic firms doing well. And typically the firms that are doing well are firms that have successfully traded globally. Okay, so maybe what we're seeing is actually it's all driven by superstar firms, in which case, okay, it's interesting. We might still slightly want to know why these superstar firms are able to make such high margins, but in principle, okay. But maybe it's just measurement error. How sure are we about these figures? For instance, they are based on very strong assumptions about the firms being not being price setters in input markets, and then profit maximizing, optimizing on that basis. Okay, but what about if there's monopsony power in the market? I'm going to come on to the evidence that there is later. So if there's monopsony power in the market, it's an argument that Keels and Traynor make, then what we're going to find is actually these are going to be overestimating what has happened to genuine product market markups. Okay? Also, the profit shares that some of these figures imply are slightly implausibly high, and you end up, well, okay, so that implies a profit share of 70% of turnover, and then we know Labour get about 55%, and then there's return to capital, and you can't fit that into 100%. So, and when we've done some work here, this is some work that we published in our State of Competition report earlier this year. I mean, we do find there's been an increase in markups, but it's a much lower increase. This is the UK compared to the other UK figures I showed. It's a much lower increase than we've seen in the other figures. And again, primarily in the top 90%, but again, much lower. Okay, so, I mean, we need to understand what's driving these things before we allow them to generate policy. I'm actually going to skip this slide in the interest of time. So just don't look at this slide, okay? It's not very interesting anyway. I can answer questions on it if you want. Okay, so that's markups. What about concentration? So that again, there is this known fact, concentration has increased across Western economies over the last 20 years. Okay, and on the basis of that, there are quite strong claims made for what competition policy should do. I think this started with Obama's Council of Economic Advisors report back in 2016, the benefits of competition indicators of market power, where they raised concerns that concentration had increased. And specifically, they had this diagram. This is the economist version of it, but this is basically what they had. And if you look at this diagram, what that shows you is the 4-firm concentration ratio, CR4, by all these industrial sectors. In 1997, light blue line, and then 2012, dark blue line. And basically the dark blue lines are always above the light blue lines. Okay, so that suggests there's a problem. Well, okay, but the level of aggregation here is very high. You know, these are industrial sectors. These are not what you'd think of as relevant antitrust markets. Okay, first point. Second point, that data goes up to 2012. So again, we've looked at this in our state of competition report, and we go up to 2021. And what you see from our analysis, you look on the left-hand side, look at the red line, it's a 5-firm concentration ratio, but near enough same as 4-firm. You will see, yes, there's an increase in concentration up to about 2012, but that has largely been reversed since 2012. And you see the same pattern in the HHIs. Okay? So again, this known fact, concentration has increased, well, actually, is it really a known fact? What does the evidence tell us? Also, again, do we have measurement error? So this is, you know, our analysis based on available stats, but there's also analysis done by European Commission, Colte et al, basically done when Tommaso Valetti was still the chief economist there. You know, and they are looking here at concentration across a number of countries, and they actually have UK concentration rising gently at a time when on our data, actually it's falling. So, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty here. And these are based on the sort of national statistics, which, yeah, apart from the fact they're not relevant markets, they also largely miss out digital. You know, when, I mean, Bob Solow, Nobel Prize winner in 1987, made the comment that, you know, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, he was not saying computer age doesn't help productivity. He was saying, why are we not capturing it in our data? We're still not capturing it in our data. We're particularly not capturing digital platforms in our data. Okay, so it's not clear that actually concentration is increasing, but this is all a very high level of aggregation. What happens if we look at a lower level of aggregation? Well, I don't have any pictures for this, but there's some really interesting work done by Affelt and Tommaso Duso and others, where they actually have thought, let's look at concentration in relevant product markets. How do you do that? Well, you don't sit and define relevant product markets across the whole economy. I mean, that way is madness. What you do, or what they have done, is they take more than 2,000 European Commission merger decisions, phase 1 and phase 2, and they look at where there is enough publicly available evidence in those decisions. They look at more than 20,000 products throughout geographic markets, and they look at what has happened to concentration in those markets, because of course lots of mergers over the period they're looking at over 20 years happen in the same markets, so you can get a bit of a time series as well as a cross section. So what do they find? Unsurprisingly, they find much higher HHIs than we do looking at the aggregate data. So HHIs above 3,000 typically, and growing. Okay, they also, and I think this is really interesting, they get a flavor that merger control was more effective at reducing concentration in the first half of their period, which was 1995 to 2004, than it was in the second half of their period, which is 2005 to 2014. So, you know, still got some work to do in the other 7 years of decisions. I'm sure they're doing that. But there is some suggestion that actually concentration in markets that matter has been increasing, and merger control has not been as successful as it should have been. Finally, before I leave this, there's also the point, which is, again, point made by the European Commission author, so Colte et al., that maybe we're asking the wrong question. We don't really care about concentration across the economy. We care about what is happening to concentration in relatively highly concentrated markets, because that's where we think you might have market power. And if they're getting more concentrated, that would be a problem. And so they have done some analysis here. And the line you need to look at here is the blue line, which shows, what this blue line shows, it shows the percentage of industries where the 4-firm concentration ratio is more than 50%. And you can see that it starts off sort of 1997 at about 15% of industries in that in that block, and it moves up to about 28% of industries in that block. So maybe concentration is increasing in those areas where we care about it. Fine. From my perspective, what I want to make here is there's a lot of really interesting suggestive stuff, but there's also a lot we don't know. We don't genuinely know if concentration is increasing. We don't genuinely know if it's increasing in a way which is harming market power. And it seems to me that there is therefore lots of scope for very interesting work to be done here. Okay, moving on quickly. So I said as also, so I start off by look at under enforcement generally, and I want to talk about merge control and raise some issues there about merge control and suggest a research agenda that would be good if we carried out. Now, I think, and look, just to reiterate that caveat, this is me, this is not the CMA speaking, okay? I think there's clear evidence of under enforcement in Europe over the last 20 years. My evidence of that is a number of high-profile digital cases, which I mentioned briefly, but also some structural things we've been doing wrong related to how we think about risk. And I'm afraid, going to blame the legal community largely for that one, sorry. How we think about innovation, no, that's on the economists, and also how we think about dominant companies extending their market power into neighboring markets. So if we think about the cases, I mean, there's no great surprise here. We all know Facebook, Instagram, that looks like a bad merger now. Facebook was willing to pay $1 billion for 13 employees and zero revenues, because of how the stock market went between them announcing the deal and making it. They only pay $750 million for 13 employees and no revenues. You would sort of think competition authorities might have thought, hang on, let's understand this better. And we might well have tried to understand it better and still allowed that merger, but we didn't try to understand it better. Facebook, WhatsApp, I mean, similar, $19 billion for a company, 10 million in revenues and 60 employees. That's a lot of money per employee. Google DoubleClick. I mean, I think the evidence is this is a really bad merger. That is the basis on which Google now has such an incredibly strong position in the ad tech stack, which is that vertical chain between advertisers who want to advertise and the advertisement that appears on your website. They not only have a very strong position there, helped also by their position in search and YouTube, based on position there, they also have a bunch of conflicts of interest where they're acting for both the buyer and the seller in the same contract. So, I think there's some clearly bad mergers there. Right. What about these conceptual approaches we've got wrong? So risk. In the UK, we explicitly have a balance of probabilities test for mergers. You allow the merger if you are less than 50% sure that it's going to lead to an SLC, a substantial lessening competition. You block the merger if you're more than 50% sure. Absolutely 50-50. I thought that's what you had in the rest of Europe, but obviously the appeal on 302 suggests otherwise. But let's just for now assume that actually there is a 50-50 in Europe as well. Now, that means that you have to make a decision based on the available evidence, however uncertain the evidence is. That means you cannot say, look, it's all really uncertain, I'm just going to allow this merger. That is the wrong answer. You still, in technical terms, need to work out where the cumulative probability function is and work out which side of that 50% figure you are. That is very, very uncomfortable for competition authorities. We hate making decisions under uncertainty. Okay, and so we tended not to. And the problem is not make a decision has been equated with we're going to allow the merger. So the default is it's all really difficult. We're going to allow the merger. Okay? That, of course, means that any merger which is very future looking, where there's a lot of uncertainty about the path of innovation or the path of market, is going to get cleared. That can't be the right answer. Or at least that's not what the law says the right answer should be. Okay, so we've not done well in risk. Okay, other two areas, innovation concerns. In the long run, what matters for economic growth is innovation. It's all lovely trying to get prices a bit closer to marginal costs. That's fantastic. But actually, that's not drives economic growth. What drives economic growth is innovation. And I think my understanding of the economic literature here is, to the extent there's an argument between Arrow and Schumpeter, Arrow won, okay? Competition drives innovation. Of course, people compete to earn those monopoly Schumpeterian profits, but it's competition that drives innovation. Okay? And I think we've lost sight of that. Or at least sometimes merger control has lost sight of that innovation is key and you only get innovation from competition. And there's a lot, at least in the UK, there's a lot of lobbying at the moment by very large, well-resourced firms trying to convince our government that no, it's the big firms. We've got lots of money, we spend lots on R&D, we're the people who are going to innovate. I just don't believe that. Incumbents never vote for disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation always comes from outsiders. It's always driven by competition. And so protecting the competitive process is absolutely key. And I don't think we've taken that into account successfully enough. But I also think, again, there's quite a lot of ignorance here. So I think there's ignorance in competition authorities about the innovation literature. That's on us. I think there's also a lot of uncertainty around the economics of innovation and how that relates to merger control. And I don't think there's a lot of agreed economic answers out there. And it's another area where I think more work is needed to be done. Very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I think that we also don't understand a lot about ecosystem theories of harm and envelopment theories of harm, particularly related to digital platforms. And those worry me, because I think what digital platforms, large firms, are able to do is, by moving into lots of neighboring markets, they are able to protect their core monopoly. So Google, almost all of Google's money comes from search, basically. You know, it makes a lot of money through advertising, but it comes from its search position. That's what everything else hangs off. And so, you know, it's expanded out. You know, the normal way of thinking about this is that got search, and then it's put a moat around it by moving out into various areas, and then it put a wall around that, and then maybe an electric fence around that, and then a moat with sharks in it. So it's just really hard to enter and compete against their core product. You know, and again, I think that damages innovation. Okay, and I think that's a real concern. But we really, there's some academic literature out there now. So, you know, Condrelli and Padilla have done some work here, there's some work being done at London Business School, but not as much as there should. Okay. Final thing I'm going to say on mergers, again, slightly an aside, but talking about research and how academics can really help us. Doing ex post analyses of mergers is really important. And I want to reassure people that they really do affect our behavior. So we've had several ex post analysis done recently. So we got Lear to do an analysis in 2019 around an ex post assessment of merger control decisions in digital markets. And one of the points that came out of that was, you don't treat uncertainty properly. Fine. I now hope we treat uncertainty properly. KPMG did analysis for us around mergers that we had allowed on the basis that entry was easy. One of the things they came back and said was, you take entry stories at their face value too often. You believe entry stories too easily. There's much of these mergers you've allowed where actually there were anti-competitive effects and entry didn't happen. Fine, we take entry stories less seriously. We push them more. Just this year, ECA did some work for us on vertical mergers. And one of the things they said is we get terribly hung up on the distinction between whether it's vertical or horizontal, rather than just looking at the effects of the analysis. To which my response is, no, of course we only ever look at the effects of the analysis. But, you know, then they lay out what we'd actually done, and you think, oh yeah, you're right. Because that effect, which is sort of horizontal, sort of vertical, because we called it vertical, we gave it a clean bill of health, whereas we probably shouldn't have done. So we really do listen to these ex posts. I would encourage people to do them. Okay. So a couple of areas where there is a push for competition policy to expand its influence. And both those areas, I'm going to argue, are in principle reasonable, but we don't know enough yet to to be sure that we're going to give a sensible answer. So the first one is labour market concerns. There will be a couple more pictures in a moment, don't worry. First one is labour market concerns. So it was David Card in his recent Nobel Prize speech said, I will try to make the case that the time has come to recognize that many or even most firms have some wage setting power. Okay, I am sure that is true. I'm also sure that competition policy has entirely ignored that for years and years and years. Actually, in the UK, we used to take account of it back in the 1980s, but certainly we haven't for the last 30-something years. But there's just beginning to be an interest in labour market issues, particularly in the US. So the FTC has been very clear on this. The DOJ have just had a no poaching case where a healthcare agency, they basically had an agreement that they weren't going to poach each other's nurses and they were going to keep nurses' wages down. I mean, I think it's pretty clearly anti-competitive. The recent Penguin Simon & Schuster merger block was all about protecting authors, you know, the money that goes to authors. So in that market, in publishing, they are the labor force. The US Department of Treasury published a report earlier this year, really interesting report, the state of labor market competition. They estimate that labor wages in the US are about 20% below the competitive level. Okay, quite controversial, but we can talk about that later. And that actually increases inequality and damages competition. So What's the evidence here? There's a lot of US evidence that labor market concentration, local labor market concentration does reduce wages, and that mergers can reduce wages. Okay, so very, very quickly, Azar et al. Find that going from the 25th percentile of HHI local labor concentration to the 75th percentile, so moving from a relatively unconcentrated labor market to a relatively concentrated labor market, is associated with wages going down somewhere between 5 and 17%. Other studies, particularly studies around hospital mergers, have shown you get a similar effect, particularly for those workers who are not mobile. So if you are a worker in a hospital and your other labor alternatives are working in another hospital, specifically in these studies, you're a nurse, that's what they looked at, then those hospital mergers decrease your wages. In a way, they don't decrease your wages for the non-healthcare professionals who, I'm working accounts for hospital, fine, I can go and do it for another firm or whatever. So I think there's quite a lot of evidence that local labor market concentration adversely affects wages, and that mergers can contribute to that. The question is, does this matter? Because we've ignored this totally in competition policy. Okay, so there's really two models of labor market. There's the monopsony model, which is basically the inverse of monopoly. It's very simple. I'm a firm, I've got lots of buyer power in the labor market, so I am going to restrict the amount of labor I buy and therefore push wages down. So it's exactly the reverse of monopoly power. And then there's sort of search and matching models of labor markets, where it's much more bargaining model between workers and firms. And in those sorts of cases, the question, what a merger might do is it might reduce the outside options for workers, and that might make them think it's less worthwhile me searching. Okay, so I'm going to be willing to take lower wages. And there's quite a lot of evidence for these search and matching models, particularly with skilled labor. Now, why does it matter? Why am I talking about models of the labor market when we should be talking about competition policy? Okay, it matters because if we're going to have to take labor market concerns into account, and there's certainly a debate about that going on in the US, I'm sure it's going to come over into Europe. The naive view that I think competition authorities have had historically is, okay, if a merger pushes wages down, that's got to be good for downstream consumers, right? Because wages are an input. So if my input costs go down, then my output price will go down. So it must be good for consumers. So, that's fine. Of course, that's not true in a monopsony model. A monopsony model, the wages go down because there's been a restriction of output upstream. If that restriction of output also happens downstream, then there's harm to consumers. So why might we care about labor markets? Or when might we care about labor markets? Well, suppose we've got a merger to monopsony. There's wages go down, restriction of output downstream as well, because the firm has got product market power. Okay, we hope we would capture that looking just at product markets, which we do already. Fine, no problem, do that already. Suppose local labor market, national product market. So I can reduce wages after my merger. That has no effect on consumers downstream. Do we care? Okay. Under what circumstances should we care? Historically, the answer is we don't care. Okay. Now, there are arguments that, well, you should care because one, workers are consumers, and two, actually, competition policy should be about economic efficiency, and you are moving further away from the efficient output, which is wages equaling marginal product of labor. Okay, that's monopsony. Think about search. In search, if you've got a search model, you can have a merger that lowers wages and increases demand for labor. So that's going to increase output downstream. So that is good for consumers, unambiguously good for consumers. It's bad news for workers upstream. Again, what are we going to do about that trade-off? Well, we don't know in Europe, I don't think, how much local labor market concentration depresses wages. We don't know the extent to which mergers in Europe have depressed wages. We don't know the extent to which any reduction in wages gets passed on to consumers downstream. There's a bunch of questions that we need to be able to answer if we're going to coherently talk about this topic of actually, should we start to care about labor markets? And it is a topic, at least in the UK, that we're definitely going to have to care about. Okay, 5 more minutes, then I will be quiet. Distributional concerns. So historically, competition policy has really only focused on economic efficiency and aggregate consumer welfare. Okay? It hasn't cared at all about the distribution of welfare. Fine. There's pretty uncontroversial. I think that economic efficiency is agnostic to distributional concerns, and you can have something that's economically efficient and deeply unfair, and equally economically efficient and really quite fair. I think we know that market power is likely to be bad for distributional equity. Why do I think we know that? Because if market power leads to prices going up to consumers, everybody suffers from those higher prices. People who own those firms, typically those in the higher income deciles, they get a bit back because they have got shares, they earn something that those higher profits reflect in the share price or in dividends or whatever. They get something back, and so they suffer less. So there is some literature here, but not as much as I would like. So Ennis et al. In really interesting paper from a couple of years ago, they estimate that market power increases the wealth of the top decile, top 10% most well-off people, by between 12 and 21%, whilst at the same time reducing the wealth of the lowest 20% by 11%. Okay, that's a substantial effect. It's quite a theoretical model they've got. Very strong assumptions underlying it. Is it a good model? Gans et al. Explicitly look at this issue of the difference between shareholdings versus consumption. In the US, 20% of consumers, the top 20% of consumers, consume as much as the bottom 60%, but they own 15 times more of the equity stakes in firms. So again, they benefit from market power, whereas the less well-off don't benefit. So again, the point here is actually that's sort of the literature, at least as far as I'm aware. But this is an issue, particularly in the US, but it's going to come over here, where distributional effects are beginning to become important. And just an illustration of that, we were told very explicitly in our last Status of Competition report to look at distributional effects of concentration. And actually, this is it for the UK. I don't know what you make of it, but it shows that consumers in the lower deciles on the left-hand side typically are buying products from markets which are more concentrated, basically because they're buying lots of foodstuffs and foodstuffs and energy and essentials. But this graph isn't particularly interesting. What is interesting is the fact that there's a push for us to produce this work. And I mean, it is interesting, that this whole distributional concern. Right then, okay, I've spoken for 30 minutes, so I'm going to 3 more minutes. Actually, sorry, I don't want to get too excited by going ahead there. New online harms. Okay, so this topic of there's a lot that's changed in 20 years. There is a lot that's changed in 20 years. We didn't have online harms then because we didn't really have it online. I just want to talk about 2 that the CMA have talked about, but which I think are very important and where there's a lot we still don't know. So one is online choice architecture. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. And we've got a paper we published in April of this year, online choice architecture, how digital design can harm competition and consumers. And the other is algorithms. We've got a paper from last year on how algorithms can reduce competition and harm consumers. What do I mean by online choice architecture? I mean, basically the way websites are designed, and it's completely pervasive in our daily interactions. So things like, what order do the search results come up? How many steps does it take you to cancel a subscription, particularly relative to how many steps it took you to take that subscription out in the first place? What's the default, that you are pushed into? And depending on the online choice architecture, our initial work, so they can certainly distort consumer choices. Defaults can absolutely do that. Can weaken competition. Again, defaults can absolutely do that. Think about Google paying Apple an enormous amount of money for Google to be the default search engine on iPhones. That's a fantastically good way for Google to minimize the chance that any other search engine is able to get onto iPhones to challenge Google's position. But our understanding around these things is very incomplete. So here, what this shows is a categorization of online choice architecture under 3 categories: choice structure, choice information, and choice pressure. But the only interesting point to take from this is, if you look at these effects, some of them have got asterisks next to them and some of them don't. Those with an asterisk are always bad news. So sludge, okay, got an asterisk next to it. It's always bad news. So the way that you take out the subscription with 1 click, it takes you 8 clicks to get rid of that subscription. That sort of stuff, always bad news. Others, like defaults, fantastically useful. We don't want to have to make choices, the same choices all the time. We want intelligent people who are well informed to make them for us a lot of the time. But as I just showed with the Google case, Google Apple case, they can also be anti-competitive. There's a lot we don't know that. Okay, and look, I could say very similar things around algorithms, around algorithmic collusion, does it exist, around personalization, high-level precise personalization, using algorithms based on large quantities of data to give choices to consumers, which actually may push them in particular ways, which are good for the firm offering the choices, but maybe not for consumers, might be moving towards first-degree price discrimination. Again, there's a lot we don't know, and that's another area where it's going to become increasingly important in competition policy over the next 20 years. There's a lot we don't know. Okay, so conclusions. So we don't know if markups have gone up, and we don't know how much they've gone up by or why. That's quite a gap there if we're going to have people making public policy decisions on that basis. We don't know whether concentration has gone up. I suspect it has in the most concentrated industries, but we don't know that. I think we've under-enforced in mergers, but we still don't have great theories of what drives innovation in the long run, and certainly not great theories that we can operationalize in merger control, even though it's incredibly important that we do that. There's a push for us to move into new areas, to move into caring about labor markets, to move into caring about distributional effects. Okay, these incredibly important things, but at the moment we don't know whether actually taking those account would change our decisions. Maybe we already capture most of those effects. And if they would change our decisions, we don't know in what direction. We don't know the size of those effects. We don't know how we might want to make those trade-offs if they arise. And then our understanding of a lot of the online harms remains incomplete. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to say. I have one final comment, which is I noticed looking at the program that session 4 is on upgrading the European Competition Network. Okay, and I don't want to beg, but please, please let us back in. It's such a useful thing. Thank you very much.